The theme of this is foreign travelers' perception of India or Indias. So why such a title? For a very simple reason that there is a stereotype which has its roots in the colonial era and the colonial perspective of India, that there was basically no India before the British came and unified this part of the world, this subcontinent. There were many Indias, there were many kingdoms, there was no political unity, there was nothing to connect these people together as one entity, and therefore India basically is born during the colonial age. This is something which finds itself repeated in many ways through many narratives, especially among our intellectual class. Even recently, there was a famous Bollywood actor, I think, who declared something very similar, that India never existed before the British. And as we know, Bollywood actors are very deep scholars, and therefore we should take their views very seriously and try to scrutinize the argument. There are many parallel statements that come along, correlated statements. For example, the fact that India was always poor, always a very poor region of the world, and poverty is not a new phenomenon. If at all there is some economic development and infrastructure, again, we should be thankful to the colonial masters of India. So these arguments, there are more of them, are reasonably, what shall I say, easy to refute, and it only takes some examination of the sources. And there are many ways to look at historical sources. We can look at, of course, archaeology. We can look at textual sources, and we can look at also testimonies from foreign travelers, which is what I'm doing today. Each source has its advantages and its drawbacks or limitations. I will not go into the other types of historical sources, textual, archaeological, and so on. But as far as the travelers are concerned, one advantage is that usually they may have less of a bias, in the sense that they will describe the land more or less as they see it, the society more or less as they see it. But in actual practice, there are also built-in biases caused by the particular motivation with which they came to India, sometimes with diplomatic or political motivations, sometimes also because they are thinking of their audience back home and how their narrative is going to impact their audience, and they want it to be well received, especially in very frequently in the case of European travelers to India in the just pre-colonial and colonial age. Very often there was a tendency to sensationalize what they were seeing, because they knew that in that case their book would sell better. So there can be all kinds of parameters which are not obvious at first, and which need to be taken into account when we deal with these narratives. Nevertheless, we find that by and large, they are very good sources, indispensable, in fact, in many cases, and they do help us to build a proper perspective of the India they saw in whatever period they may be. And as you will see today, I will be dealing with a very wide period of time, starting from possibly the most ancient travelers or chroniclers of India, because some chroniclers visited India, others did not, but depended for their chronicles on accounts of travelers. So we will be using all of this. And the basic question we are asking is, how do they see India? Would they agree with the colonial argument that there is basically no India, or not one region identifiable as India, or let us say an integrated entity at some level? So let me now start my presentation, my slides, as a support of what the argument I wish to develop. So we will visit, in fact, these travelers. We will see them, and the map in the background is one of the many maps, of course, here during the European period that will be drawn in the course of the centuries to try to make sense of India's position in the world and of course the whole Indo-Pacific region eventually. So let me begin with a simple argument, which in a way could be the end of this whole presentation. And it is, how do we say these travelers come to India and depict India and talk about India, but what word do they use? Do they use one word? Do they use many words? And the surprising answer, or not so surprising, is that they use one word. They do not use many words for the different regions of India. Or if they do, they are sub-regions, they are sub-terminology, which is under the umbrella of India as a whole. So in Greek, it is either Indica or India. In Latin, also India. In Chinese, Hindu, which also derive from India. But there is another term, which is Jiangsu. I apologize, I'm sure I mispronounce Mandarin. In Arabic or Persian, very well known, Hindustan, and then English, and for French, and Hindi for Dutch, and we could go on, adding Italian, Spanish, and whatnot, and we would always have this term coming back. This term, it's well known, comes originally from Sindhu, the river Indus, which is first so named in the Rig Veda, and which in Persian became Hindu because the initial S in Sindhu cannot be pronounced and is generally replaced by H. So Sindhu became Hindu, and this was a purely geographical term at first, and Hindu became the synonym for the region of Sindh, because that is, of course, the initial region that most travelers will come upon, and eventually became a synonym for the whole of India. And Hindu became a synonym for also the inhabitants of India. It is only much later that the term will acquire religious connotation. And so the answer is quite unanimous. All these travelers in all these languages are using one term and only one for India. With, of course, some qualifications that sometimes they will subdivide this land into different regions because they realize it is quite huge, and they want to be a little more precise or specific, which is the case, for example, with Mandarin, with the Chinese travelers who, from the beginning, divide India into 5 parts. They are quite natural. We still use this terminology today. East, West, North, South, and Central India. For example, Middle Jiangsu is in fact not what we would call today Madhya Pradesh. It corresponds roughly to Bihar and Jharkhand, and it is the dominant region in Chinese accounts for the very simple reason that this is the heartland of Buddhism. And that is what is of supreme interest to the Chinese travelers to India. And because they want to visit the sites associated with the Buddha, the sites where he preached, where he taught, where the first monasteries were created, and so on. So this is a dominant region, but you see they are aware that there is another region east of that and south of that, and so on. So this kind of geographical division does occur often enough, but it doesn't mean that they are referring to different entities altogether. Let me develop further by having a closer look at the geography in certain accounts. And we now go back to the Greek accounts, which are among the very first that we have as far as foreign testimonies of India is concerned. And here we go with Arrian. Arrian, or Lucius Flavius Arrianus, was a Greek historian and philosopher of the, as you can see, the predominantly the 2nd century CE, and he chronicled various parts of the world, including much of Africa, Middle Asia, in India, and left very important accounts. And what he says very simply is that the countries which lie to the east of the Indus, you see, this is always the natural boundary for incoming travelers, I take to be India proper, and the people who inhabit them to be Indians. It's as simple as you could wish, and very explicit. And he defines India between the Indus, the Himalayas, which he calls Mount Taurus. Of course, travelers will sometimes give various terminologies, and Aryan actually is not a traveler, he's a chronicler. He didn't come to India as far as I know. And the terminologies may vary or may get heavily distorted also after passing through several hands. And so therefore, the Indus on the west, Himalayas in the north, the Eastern Sea in the east, because they were not in Greek times very well aware at all of South India. They didn't know where it extended, but they were aware of the Ganges and the Bay of Bengal in the estuary of the Ganges. So therefore, Eastern Sea is part of their narrative. However, he draws on another source, Megasthenes, the author of Indica, a major study of India, which unfortunately is lost in its integrality, but survives through fairly substantial extracts in a number of Greek and Roman authors, including Aryan himself. And Megasthenes thankfully lists 58 rivers. Interestingly, all of them navigable. Today, it would be very interesting to count how many of them are navigable. It's only a small proportion, right? That's another issue. And Megasthenes adds the rivers of India are certainly the largest to be found in all Asia. So here again, India is one geographical entity, and they are to some extent aware of its diversity. Then we can move forward in time and take the case of the Arab historian, geographer, and traveler Al-Masudi in the 10th century CE. And his description is like this: India is a vast country. It's, again, one country. He doesn't speak of many countries, extending over sea and land and mountains. It borders on the country of Zabaj, which is Java, which is the kingdom of the Maharaj, the king of the islands whose dominions separate India and China, which is quite correct, but are considered as part of India. Quite interesting. We will not be able to develop this today. It's another topic altogether, but this reminds us of how in the 19th century, European scholars who discovered the massive Indian influence over the whole of Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand and beyond, call this whole region of Southeast Asia Greater India. Greater India is not an Indian term, it's a European term, very interestingly, which of course today is no longer much in use, but it does point to the cultural sphere and influence that India exerted over this entire region. So this is why Al-Masudi tells us that this is part of India. India extends on the side of the mountains to Khorasan and Sindh as far as Tibet. So this is the whole northwest mountainous boundary of India. Now we have a look at some of the Chinese travelers. There were many of them, if I remember, possibly 15 Chinese pilgrims to India have been documented. Not all of their records are available, but some of the most important ones, there are actually 3 dominant travelogues to India, are first of all that of Fahian, that used to be the pronunciation, probably today something like Faxian. And this is mostly in the 4th century CE. And here is a statue of him somewhere in China today. And we must keep in mind that these Chinese pilgrims to India, as I said earlier, are basically interested in Buddhism, the Buddhist heritage. It doesn't mean that they do not speak of other things, but many of their remarks are on other aspects of India, other sects, for example, other schools of thought, and sometimes the society itself and the social practices are almost incidental to their narrative. So this needs to be, when their testimony is studied closely, it needs to be kept in mind. But today we are not doing a deep study analysis of their testimony. What we look at is basically their footprint. And here, let me remove his statue. You can see that these travelers have to undertake a long and dangerous journey through Central Asia, and in particular the Taklamakan Desert, which is a very forbidding region. And they enter India usually through Gilgit or sometimes through Afghanistan. And then you see the movement through the whole of North India. And basically, this is what is called in Indian inscriptions Uttarapatha. That is to say, the northern route, the northern road, and which connects northwest India to the Bay of Bengal. And this is also, especially in its eastern part, the whole heartland of Buddhism, which was of interest to Fayen. And in his case, he decided to go back by sea, which was equally, and if I remember well, his ship was wrecked at some point, equally an adventurous journey. So, but nevertheless not unknown, because there is, just as there is a Silk Road or Silk Route, actually many roads across Central and then Middle Asia, there is also a maritime Silk Route, and this is part of it. And this is a Chinese copy of his travelogue, the very detailed travelogue that he left. The best known, perhaps, of the Chinese pilgrim is Xuanzang or Xuanzang. And here we see him traveling through perhaps Central Asia or India with his elaborate decorated backpack. And in his case, the journey is even more complex because he also travels through Central Asia and comes in through Afghanistan. This is probably after crossing Bamiyan, which, as we know, was a major Buddhist site with the two giant Buddhas, which were dynamited some years ago. And then landing at Taxila or Taxila, which was a very important Buddhist, but also late Vedic and Jain center of learning. And then again, following the same route, but then he will travel further south all the way to Kanchipuram in today's Tamil Nadu, and going back to Western India, even visiting parts of Gujarat. So again, a very difficult and adventurous journey, taking altogether quite a few years. And it's a miracle that these pilgrims could do it without too much of misadventure and leaving those elaborate chronicles when they return to China. Excuse me. Now, this is the third, and this is Itzing or Yijing, who had also an elaborate route, but this is mostly maritime, and his visit to India is confined to the eastern part of the Gangetic Plains. So now, elaborating on his record, which is called the Record of Buddhism as Practiced in India, Sent Home from the Southern Seas. This is the title of his travelogue, and you can see that Buddhism is central to his visit to this whole region. He writes in his introduction, if you read, excuse me, if you read this record of mine, you may, without moving one step, travel in all the 5 countries of India. So remember, the 5 countries are the 5 regions that we saw right at the beginning. As to the 5 countries of India, the boundaries are wide and remote. Roughly, the distance from central India to the limit in each direction is about 400 yojanas. Now, there is some yojanas. There is some confusion and controversy, unfortunately, about the exact value of a yojana, and it varies between something like 7 kilometers and 13.6 kilometers. So possibly in this case, taking the value prevalent in these days, it might be 2,700 kilometers, which would be a little too wide, or else we have to modify the value of the yojana. The remote frontier not being counted in this measurement. He's speaking here of the Himalayan natural frontiers. Although I myself did not see all these parts of India, I could nevertheless ascertain anything by careful inquiry. Of course, these inquiries are not always as reliable as they might have thought. So now that we have seen the geography, let me begin with the question of whether India was poor or nothing remarkable or particularly wealthy, and what do these travelers tell us on this question? Because I've heard it said and said quite often that that India was steeped in poverty for all time, and the argument is often that the cause of this poverty was the caste system. So we're not going to deal with the caste system at all today, because that is a whole separate development. But the point about India's wealth is easy to address, and our travelers and chroniclers like Diodorus Siculus here, a Greek historian of the 1st century BCE, have a lot to say on this, and usually it's emphatically a statement of India as an extremely wealthy region of the world. While the soil of India bears on its surface all kinds of fruits known to cultivation, and that is true, the monsoon climate of India made, and those gigantic alluvial plains of the Indus and the Ganges and other rivers made agriculture far easier than in other parts of the world. It has also undergone numerous veins of all numerous veins of all sorts of metals, for it contains much gold and silver and copper and iron in no small quantity, and even tin and other metals, which are employed to make articles of use and ornament, as well as implements and accoutrements of war. This is perfectly correct and totally confirmed by archaeological excavations in many parts of India. And the whole story of the metallurgy of India, known as archaeometallurgy in ancient times, is very well known. And Diodorus's statement is simply factual. If we go to another Chinese pilgrim of India, not among those whom I mentioned, 6th century CE, he says, from here, he's speaking from Mathura, to the south, all the country is Middle India or Madhya Desha. He mentions Madhya Desha by a name slightly distorted in Mandarin. Its people are rich. The inhabitants of Madhya Desha dress and eat like people in China. Now, why should he say that? We know it's not true. There is an intention. And the intention is that most travelers from China to regions outside of China portrayed those regions usually as barbaric. China was the only civilized region of the world. This is a common theme running through a lot of travelers' testimonies, with one exception, and that exception is India. In the case of India, Chinese travelers do not portray India or Indians as barbarian. They, on the contrary, portray India as a highly civilized region. And one of the reasons for this portrayal is actually Buddhism. But there are others. And here the wealth is one of them. And so why should Li Daoyuan say that they eat and dress like Chinese people is simply another way of saying that they are highly civilized and wealthy. If we look at now at an Arab historian of the 14th century, Shihabuddin al-Umari, he states that this is the most important country which cannot be compared with any other country in the world in respect of its extensive territories, its abounding wealth, and numerous armies. The grandeur of the Sultan, he's referring in this case to Bin Tughlaq, when he travels or is in residence or in respect of the might of his empire. The fame and renown of this country is well known. It is the country in whose seas there are pearls, which is correct, factual, and in whose land there is gold, and in whose mountains there are rubies and diamonds, and in whose valleys there is aloe wood and camphor, and in whose cities there are the thrones of the kings. Among its animals, there are elephants and rhinoceros. From its iron are made the Indian swords. The Indian swords were reputed all over the Mediterranean world because they were made with a very special kind of steel called the Wood's steel, which could be very thin and light and yet very, very sharp and not brittle, unlike conventional steel. So this was a technological innovation which arose in India and which made Indian steel much prized, especially for military purposes. In it, there are mines of iron, quicksilver, and lead, and from some of its places there comes saffron, and in some of its valleys there are crystals. In it, the good things of life are in abundance, prices here are cheap, its armies are numberless, and its territories are limitless. So if you remove a little bit of the emphatic tone, it's actually quite factual and verifiable. And moving further, 13th century, the celebrated Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant, who says, in the case of India, leaving the island of Ceylon or Ceylon and sailing in a westerly direction 60 miles, you reach the great province of Malabar, which is, of course, Malabar, which is an approximation for South India in his case, which is not an island, but a part of the continent of the Greater India, as it is termed, being the noblest and richest country in the world. So this richest country in the world is found in the pen, under the pen of a surprising number of travelers. And therefore, there's something wrong definitely with the argument of India steeped perennially in poverty, because in that case, all of these travelers got it wrong. Let us examine one reason for this wealth of India, though it has already been conveyed to some extent in the extracts we saw. And the reason is here, right in front of you, and this is the testimony of India's external trade. Here we have a map corresponding to the periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which is a first century document in colloquial Greek. It's simply a handbook for sailors. It's written by a sailor and it documents all the ports of this entire region which you see here, from the Red Sea all the way to the eastern coast of India. And not only all the ports and not only their navigable qualities or dangers occasionally, but also the kind of goods that can be traded in each and every of these ports. So it's a remarkable document. It's been mined again and again by historians for at least 200 years. And what we see here is that in the case of India, there are a large succession of ports, many, many more than the dots that you can see. And you see here for all of these ports, there are color-coded the various kinds of goods like spices, like precious stones, textiles, that is not, I think, cloth is a little bit mentioned. But there are many, many more things that were exported from India through the Red Sea and then overland to the Mediterranean and finally to either Greece or what is today Italy. So this document itself is an evidence of the kind of goods that were produced in India and which are summed up here by, again, Diodorus Siculus, who says that in addition to cereals, there grows throughout India much millet, which is kept well watered by the profusion of river streams, and much pulse of superior quality, and rice also. So this is a testimony to the great agricultural production, which is also confirmed through many other sources, including paleobotany in archaeological excavations. It is accordingly affirmed that famine has never visited India and that there has never been a general scarcity in the supply of nourishing food. For since there is a double rainfall in the course of each year, which is certainly true of especially Eastern India, but even in Western India, this would include the winter rains. One in the winter season, that's right, when the sowing of wheat takes place, as in other countries, and the second at the time of the summer solstice, so that's, of course, the summer monsoon, which is a proper season for sowing rice and bosporum, as well as sesamum and millet. The inhabitants of India almost always gather in 2 harvests annually. You know, unlike most countries in colder climates, where in traditional times there would have been only one major crop. The fact is almost all the plains in the country have a moisture which is alike genial, whether it is derived from the rivers or from the rains of the summer season, which are wont to fall every year at a stated period with surprising regularity, while the heat which prevails ripen the roots which grows in the marshes and especially those of the tall reeds. So this is about Indian agriculture. Then if we turn to I Ching, water is exceedingly abundant in the pools everywhere. It's considered meritorious to dig ponds, very correct and attested by many Indian texts actually. If we go but 1 yojana, so let us say 7 to 13 kilometers, we see 20 or 30 bathing places and they vary in size. The world-honored one, and you can guess who he is referring to, taught at Nalanda how to build a bathroom, to construct a brick pond in an open place, and to make a medical bath in order to cure a disease. Sometimes he ordained the whole body to be anointed with oil, sometimes the feet rubbed with oil every night, or the head every morning. For such a practice is very good for maintaining clear eyesight and keeping off the cold. And we have here very clearly recipes that are still recommended in Ayurveda. So this is a testimony, and there are more, to Indian medical know-how. Let me shift to a completely different kind of traveler. This is from Iceland, John Olafsson, in the 17th century, who describes a great multitude of craftsmen in India. They work in masonry, wood, clay, and iron after all kinds of patterns. They also make statuary, statues, and work surpassingly well in copper, in elephant bone and tusks. Do masterly work in gold set with precious stones and pearls, and in silver and brass. Moreover, they are very skillful in every kind of weaving and in painting and dyeing their cotton cloth with every kind of color. It's a very good summary of some of the leading Indian technologies, right from ancient times to, as you can see here, the immediate pre-colonial era. This is confirmed even in the beginning of the colonial era, 18th century, by other travelers, such as this French traveler, Le Joux de Flay, who was actually an engineer and was extremely interesting. He's left fantastic testimonies. I don't think they are available in English. of Indian technologies because he looked at them as an engineer, and he was always struck by the admirable economy and skill that Indians used in their manufacturing techniques, and he has unbounded admiration for Indian craftsmen in particular. So his testimony here: inventors of the sciences and of almost all the arts. I mean, this is almost too much of a compliment. The Indians have made precious and precise observations on agriculture and have carried out many trials and experiments in all the branches of rural economy, an admirable consequence of civilization and of the aversion that Hindus have always had for war. Now, of course, the last statement is somewhat debatable. It is true that the population at large probably always disliked war, but at the same time, we do know that warfare has been a constant in historical India. So this would have to be slightly qualified, but if it applies to the population at large, it may be accepted to some extent. Then the last part of my presentation is about the culture, the ethics of this subcontinent, because it could be argued that what I have shown so far is basically about the economy and the technologies shared over the subcontinent, but ultimately what decides whether there was one India or several Indias is ultimately whether there is a cultural integration of the entire subcontinent. And let us hear what the travelers have to say. So I'll go back to Strabo, first of all, or maybe we have not seen him yet. In that case, let me introduce this Greek geographer, philosopher, and historian who straddles the 1st century BCE and CE. And his testimony is quite eloquent. He says the Indians, and please note once again, it's the Indians, it is not many different, distinct, separate peoples, it's only one. All live frugally, especially when in camp, that is to say, outside of their native place or their place of customary residence. Theft is a thing of very rare occurrence. Indians are a people who have no written laws, but are ignorant of writing, and that's not quite correct, of course, and conduct all matters by memory. They have no suits about pledges or deposits, nor do they require either seals or witnesses, but make their deposits and confide in one another. The houses and property are for the most part unguarded. Their favorite mode of exercising the body is by friction in various ways, but especially by passing smooth ebony rollers over the surface of the body. Their tombs are plain, which is correct. Indians almost never invested much in spectacular tombs or graves the way Western rulers often did. And the mounds raised over the dead lowly. In contrast to the simplicity they observed in other matters, they love finery and ornament. They wear dresses worked in gold and adorned with precious stones, and also flowered robes made of fine muslin. They respect alike truth and virtue. Hence, they assign no special privilege to the old unless they possess superior wisdom. So there would be quite a lot that we could discuss on each and every of these statements. But remember, this is a Greek geographer, historian of the Alexander the Great and his campaigns through Asia, his conquest of India. What's remarkable is that he doesn't have a motive for praising Indians excessively. He's trying to give a fair estimate based on what is read and heard. And even if there are exaggerations, it is not part of his intention. So this has to be kept in mind when we assess such statements. Aryan again refers to Megasthenes, saying that the Indians neither invade other people nor do other people invade the Indians. Of course, he does know that Alexander invaded the northwestern part of India, but could not go much beyond the Indus proper. Indians do not rear monuments to the dead, again, but consider the virtues which men have displayed in life and the songs in which their praises are celebrated, sufficient to preserve their memory after death. So what makes the way someone is remembered is the virtues, the qualities that people have embodied and practiced, not the glorious tombs and other monuments. Diodorus, there are usages observed by Indians which contribute to prevent the occurrence of famine among them. For whereas among other nations it is usual in the contests of war to ravage the soil and thus to reduce it to an uncultivated waste, among the Indians, on the contrary, by whom husbandmen, that is to say agriculturists, are regarded as a class that is sacred and inviolable, the tillers of the soil, even when battle is raging in their neighborhood, are undisturbed by any sense of danger. For the combatants on either side in waging the conflict make carnage of each other, but allow those engaged in husbandry, in agriculture, to remain quite unmolested. This perhaps is a little idealized, and there are in history a few unfortunate testimonies of Indian kings not respecting this convention. At the same time, it was part of the Kshatriya Dharma, the code, at least the ideal code, that the common people should not be touched by the war. And here Diodorus contrasts actually the Indian practice, hoping it was sufficiently widespread, with that of Western conquerors like Alexander the Great, who had a habit of sacking cities after their conquest, so that his army could, plunder them and acquire some riches. And sometimes he boasts, or his chroniclers boast, that he put entire populations through the sword when they resisted his conquest. So this kind of practices are not so common in Indian history, at least not in the pre-Islamic era. Now we turn to Tansen Sen, who is a modern scholar of Chinese Indian interaction, and I've used some of his entries in this presentation. And his reflection is very interesting. He says, Chinese pilgrims played a key role in the exchanges between ancient India and ancient China, no doubt. They introduced new texts and doctrines to the Chinese clergy, carried Buddhist paraphernalia for the performance of rituals and ceremonies, and provided detailed accounts of their spiritual journeys to India. These travel records contributed to the development of a unique perception of India among members of the Chinese clergy. For some, India was, and remember that conventionally in China, regions outside China were supposed to be barbarian, and China was the only civilized region of the world. For some, India was a sacred, even utopian realm. Utopian. That's very correct, because once a region is idealized, then everything becomes perfect. And that is indeed how some tended to portray India. Others saw India as a mystical land inhabited by civilized and unsophisticated people. In the context of Chinese discourse on foreign peoples, who were often described as uncivilized and barbaric, these accounts significantly elevated the Chinese perception of Indian society. This perception of India as a civilized society persisted until the 10th century, kindled through the reports of later Chinese pilgrims and the works of Chinese clergy that highlighted the erudition of Indian people and the complexity of their society and cultural traditions. These pilgrims, by returning with Buddhist texts, relics, and other paraphernalia, tried to recreate in China an Indic world. So here, of course, it is very largely through the influence of Buddhism. So we can see here that, once again, there is no attempt to portray Indian culture and ethical practices and codes in a fragmented manner. It is presented in a unified manner. It doesn't mean, of course, that there were no variations and no diversity in India. We know naturally that there was plenty of diversity, but it does mean that those travelers perceived Indian culture and the whole society as essentially one and the same integrated whole. It's seen referring to Ashwagosha, who was a Buddhist, a great Buddhist scholar, and he mentions that he authored the Buddha Karita Kavya. This extensive work, if translated, would consist of more than 10 volumes. It is widely read through the 5 divisions of India and the countries of the Southern Sea. So here is an actual example how one book, and we know, of course, that there were many, many more, one Buddhist text was studied across the whole of India. And this is, of course, going to be the same story with a lot of Sanskrit literature, with the Mahabharata, Ramayana, with the Puranas, with a lot of poetry, and so on and so forth. So here again, it is the 5 divisions of India and the whole subcontinent at once. Let us turn for a change to a Korean monk, and this is in the 8th century CE. His name would be something like He Cho or Ko, I'm not very sure. And he tells us that the dress, language, customs, and laws of the 5 regions of India, once again, this concept of 5, are similar. So he's telling us quite plainly that there is not much difference in all these 5 regions. There is something recognizable as one, even though there will be variations. Only the language of the village folk in South India is different. Yes, indeed, the South Indian languages belong to a different linguistic family. Kashmir is counted as part of North India. Very correct. Kashmir was always an integral part of India without any sense of separation. And this is a point that Professor Shonalika Kaul has developed quite extensively in her study of the early history of Kashmir. The national laws of the 5 regions of India prescribe no kanga. So kang is this very forbidding, terrible wooden collar that criminals were sometimes made to wear as a punishment, and they would have to, go about in the streets wearing this huge wooden collar. So the laws prescribe no kang, beatings, or prison. This is a little idealized. Those who are guilty are fined in accordance with the degree of the offense committed. According to the law of the 5 regions of India, see, the law is in singular, even though the regions are in plural. Those who travel do not carry food. They can beg for food wherever they go. Yes, indeed, there were great traditions of hospitality and sometimes also shelters for travelers, especially for pilgrims. When the king and the chiefs travel, they take food with them so as not to bother the people. People rarely drink much. I have traveled across the 5 regions, but have not seen any drunken brawls. So slightly idealized, but still we can relate to some known facts about Indian culture and ethics. Said al-Andalusi, Spanish historian and astronomer, the Indians among all nations through the centuries and since antiquity were the source of wisdom, justice, and moderation. They were a people endowed with virtues of self-control, creators of sublime thoughts, universal fables, and perhaps that is an indirect reference to texts like the Panchatantra, rare inventions, technology, and remarkable conceptions, philosophy. So let us continue, because we are going to close this series with some very interesting observation by European scholars. Indians are naturally inclined to justice and never depart from it in their actions. Once again, we wish that were totally true, and this is by Sharif al-Idrisi, geographer of the 11th century. Their good faith, honesty, and fidelity to their engagements are well known, and they are so famous for these qualities that people flock to their country from every side. And al-Masudi, I forget his period, but something similar. There prevails a great difference of language and religion in these kingdoms. So this is about regional diversity of India. And they are frequently at war with each other, which is correct. Most of them believe in metempsychosis, reincarnation, or the transmission of the soul. The Hindus are distinct from all other black people, as the Zanjis, the Damadans, and others. I'm not sure what these refer to. In point of intellect, government, philosophy, strength of constitution, and purity of color. What he is trying to say is that among dark-skinned people, the Hindus stand out in terms of intellectual and political development. Now we come to the colonial era, and we do remember, of course, that there were a lot of colonial scholars who tried to denigrate Indian civilization, even deny its existence, in the whole line of argument of the white man's burden, that is to say, the responsibility placed by Providence on the British to civilize India and make it a modern nation. And it's very interesting that despite this general trend of belittling, sometimes completely rejecting, negating, denying Indian accomplishments as a civilization, there were exceptions, notable exceptions. So I'm going to here look at a few, beginning with John Malcolm, governor of Bombay in the Bombay Presidency in 1813. And this is the time, of course, of the East India Company. And he says the Hindu inhabitants are a race of men, generally speaking, not more distinguished by their lofty stature than they are for some of the finest qualities of the mind. They are brave, generous, and humane, and their truth is as remarkable as their courage. Mount Stuart Elphinstone, well-known historian and first governor of the same Bombay Presidency, tells us that no set of people among the Hindus are so depraved as the dregs of our great towns. He's referring, of course, to Britain. The villagers are everywhere amiable, affectionate to their families, kind to their neighbors. The Hindus are mild and gentle people. Their superiority in purity of manners is not flattering to our self-esteem. These are by high colonial officials trying to portray the Indian society that they see. And in conclusion, we turn to Friedrich Max Müller, the German-born scholar who worked at Oxford for most of his life after a little stint in Paris, and who, as is well known, published the first complete edition of the Vedas and some of the major commentaries, and also major other texts like the Upanishads. So he was a great Orientalist, as people called it in those days, Sanskritist, mythologist, and many other things. And he surveyed all of these testimonies, some of which I have used directly from his own book, which is What Indians Can Teach Us. And his remark is that it is surely extremely strange that whenever, either in Greek or in Chinese or in Persian or in Arab writings, and we saw samples of most of them, we meet with any attempts at describing the distinguishing features in the national characters of the Indians, regard for truth and justice should always be mentioned first. So he's surprised, and maybe we are surprised, to see that the ethical character of Indians should be so highly praised by traveler after traveler, chronicler after chronicler, from ancient to colonial times. So there had to be something to justify this reality. But the point here is that this is a character that is attributed to the whole subcontinent. There is no distinction here in terms of culture or ethics in separate fragments of this land. And we will continue or possibly end with Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, very often quoted traveler to India, here in a scene in a splendid attire. And he was a merchant. He was a gem merchant. And of course, he was attracted to India by its reputation of being a treasure house of gems. And India exported gems for something like 2,000 years at least. Very Christian at the same time, so using Christian terminology like idolaters here, referring to non-Christians in any part of the world. All the idolaters who are subjects of the great Mughal and other princes on either side of the Ganges, at least once in their lives, make a pilgrimage to perform their devotions at one of the 4 pagodas which I have named, and most commonly to that of Jagannath, it being the principal and most considerable of all. What is he referring to? He's referring to the Char Dham pilgrimage across India. Badrinath in the north, Puri, Jagannath in the east, Dwarka in the south, in the west, I'm sorry, and Rameshwaram in the south. And therefore he's showing us one of the mechanisms by which India was one integrated cultural entity. These pilgrimages are not made as in Europe by 1 or 2 individual pilgrims, but the people of a town or several villages assemble and travel together in company, which is quite factual and still valid today. The poor who come from afar, sometimes from 300 or 400 leagues, with all the savings which they have accumulated for that purpose during their lives, are unable to bear the expenses of the journey, and they are assisted by the rich, who expend very great sums in such alms. Each one travel according to his station and means, some in palanquins or litters, other in carriages, and the poor, some on foot, others on oxen, the mother carrying her child, and the father the cooking utensils. So this is an interesting confirmation of what we know even in recent times. Let me conclude, and I think my conclusion is plain and straightforward. It is based, as I repeat, on these numerous testimonies. I maybe selected perhaps 20 of them. We could have, instead of 20, we could have 50 or 100, and it would make no difference. It is absolutely clear that the travelers look at this land as one geographical unit, but also the Indians as one people. They are aware of the regional diversity, even linguistic diversity, and yet they speak of the Indians as one. So in terms of cultural, socio-economic context, there is no doubt for them that India exists. And this is the reply to the whole argument. Their observations are mostly, except of course when they go into specific details, of a pan-Indian nature. And I think this is the simplest and most straightforward answer that we can give. Again, there would be many others based on Indian sources, Indian texts, Indian archaeology, Indian epigraphy, to show that there are numerous ways by which this subcontinent was woven into one cultural entity. Thank you for your attention.